She had been beaten 100 times, left in the dust with her little girl clinging to her side, whispering, "Mama will never heal." But then a lone cowboy appeared, muscles carved by years of hardship, his black stallion Onyx towering in the fading light. He knelt and promised just 5 words that would change everything. "I'll be gentle every step." What happened next will break your heart and mend it all over again. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know. Wishing you a beautiful day. And don't forget to subscribe, because more stories of courage and hope are waiting just for you. The last light of day clung stubbornly to the rugged spine of Ironwood Mesa, painting the cliffs in shades of violet and bronze as the cicadas droned their hymn into the falling dusk. The air smelled of dust and mesquite, and heat still shimmered off the land, though the sun had long begun its descent. Jace Callahan rode the trail as he had so many nights before, broad shoulders swaying with the rhythm of his stallion's stride, his silence as heavy as the twilight itself. At 32, Jace had the body of a man shaped by years of labor, broad chest, thick arms corded with muscle, and a back straightened by the saddle more than by any bed. His face, square and shadowed with stubble, carried lines carved by grief more than age, and his blue-gray eyes rarely revealed more than guarded calculation. The town of Ironwood whispered many things about him, that he was hard, unyielding, a man of stone. But beneath the brim of his sweat-stained hat was someone who had learned too young that attachments meant weakness, that caring left scars deeper than bullets. Onyx, the stallion beneath him, was the one companion who shared his exile. 8 years old, a black Mustang with a coat like polished obsidian and a mane that tore wild against the wind, Onyx was known across 3 counties for his temper. He bit, he bucked, and to most, he was untouchable. Yet under Jace's hand, he was something else. Restless, yes, but loyal, carrying his master with a kind of feral pride. The trail wound between cottonwoods and stone, and Jace guided Onyx with lazy ease until it came, a sound sharp and alien against the drone of insects. At first it was faint, like an animal's bleat caught on the wind. He frowned, reining in the stallion, the muscles beneath him quivering as Onyx's ears twitched toward the source. Then the sound came again, clearer this time, raw and piercing. Words broke through the dusk. "Mama, please." Jace's chest tightened, his heartbeat stumbling into a faster rhythm. He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots striking the brittle grass. Onyx tossed his head, nostrils flaring, but Jace pressed a steady hand to the black neck, murmuring low until the stallion stilled. Then he moved toward the cry. In the clearing, the sight that met him stopped him cold. A woman lay crumpled in the dust, her dress torn and streaked with blood and dirt, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. Her face was swollen, purpled with bruises, lips split and parched. She might have been mistaken for lifeless if not for the faint rise and fall of her chest. At her side knelt a girl, small and slight, no more than 6 years old. Her hair, the color of wheat in late summer, was tangled and dulled by grime. Her cheeks were wet with tears, her dress torn at the hem, bare feet cut from the rocks. In her hands she gripped a broken branch as if it were a weapon, holding it between Jace and her mother's body. Her gray eyes, storm-colored, bright even through fear, locked on him with a ferocity beyond her years. "Don't touch her," the child gasped, her voice ragged but fierce. "Don't hurt her more." Jace froze a few paces away, lowering himself slowly until his massive frame no longer loomed like a threat. He removed his hat, setting it on the ground beside him, then deliberately unbuckled his gun belt and laid it in the dirt. "I'm not here to harm you," he said, his voice low and steady, though rough from disuse. The girl's lip trembled. She clutched the stick tighter, pressing herself against her mother's ribs. "They all said that." Her words struck him like a brand. He thought of his brother, beaten to death a decade ago in a cattle brawl while men stood laughing. He thought of his own mother, shrinking from blows she could never escape. Jace had built walls around those memories, but here, in the dirt, they rose before him again. He let his hands rest open on his knees, palms up, showing his emptiness. "Look," he said softly, "I put the gun away. I won't touch her unless you let me." For a moment, the girl's eyes blazed with defiance, but then her gaze flicked down to the still form beneath her. The woman's breathing was shallow, each inhale rattling, her skin pale beneath the bruises. The girl's courage faltered in the face of helplessness. With a small sob, she lowered the branch but did not let it fall completely. Jace inched closer, slow enough for her to stop him if she chose. When she did not, he knelt by the woman and pressed the back of his rough hand to her lips, feeling for breath. Faint warmth touched his skin. He leaned close, listening at her chest, catching the weak flutter of a heartbeat. Relief, sharp and unexpected, swept through him. "Who did this?" His question was quiet, not to wound but to understand. The girl's voice broke on the answer. "Men from town. They said Mama owed. Papa's gone. They left her." The last words dissolved into sobs. Jace closed his eyes briefly, the old bitterness rising like bile. Debt collectors, vultures fattened on cruelty. He opened them again, fixing his gaze on the child. "What's your name?" "Mara," she whispered, clutching the woman tighter. He nodded once. "Mara, I can't leave her here. I can't leave you here. But if I carry her, you'll have to trust me." The girl hesitated, eyes narrowing as if weighing his soul. At last she spoke, her words like a fragile bargain. "You'll be gentle." Every step his throat tightened, and for the first time in years, his vow felt like prayer. "Every step," he swore. Carefully he slid his arms beneath the woman's body. She stirred faintly, a broken moan slipping from her lips, but did not wake. Her weight in his arms was far too light for a grown woman, yet the burden pressed against him like iron. Mara scrambled to his side, clutching the edge of his coat, refusing to let go. Onyx shifted uneasily as they returned, the stallion's ears pinned back, nostrils flaring at the scent of blood. Jace whispered steady words, rubbing the black neck until the horse stilled. Mara stepped forward, tiny hand outstretched, her eyes pleading. Onyx blew hot air through his nostrils, stamping once, and Jace nearly pulled her back. But the child did not falter. She laid her palm against the stallion's flank. For a heartbeat, Onyx stiffened. Then his massive body eased, breath huffing soft through his nose. Mara's tears slowed, her lips parting in something close to awe. It was as though the horse, untamed to all others, had recognized a kindred wound. Jace lifted the woman into the saddle, seating her carefully against his chest. He swung up behind, placing Mara between them, her small fingers clinging to the reins, though she could not hope to guide them. His arm circled the woman to keep her steady, the other anchoring the child. The sun sank lower, spilling crimson across the mesa, the sky bleeding into shadow. Onyx moved forward with deliberate steps, carrying not only the weight of 3 bodies, but of a promise spoken into dusk. Jace's chest was heavy, yet not with dread alone. There was certainty now, unsettling in its clarity. His life, long defined by silence and solitude, had just been altered forever. As cicadas quieted and stars pricked the vast dome of night, Jace Callahan rode onward beneath the ironwood skies. He did not know what waited on the trail ahead, judgment, danger, perhaps more sorrow. But with the broken woman against him and the child pressed close, and with Onyx steady beneath, he knew only this: he would not set them down, not here, not ever. Every step would be gentle. Every step would be theirs. The night closed heavy and still around Ironwood Mesa as Jace Callahan guided Onyx through the thicket of cottonwoods, the stallion's dark form moving steady under the pale glow of the moon. The trail felt longer than it ever had, every hoofbeat carrying not just the weight of 3 bodies, but the burden of the promise he had given, a vow to be gentle, every step, until there was no more ground left to cover. The woman in his arms hung limp as a shadow, her head rolling faintly against his chest, while the little girl sat pressed against his side, her small fingers gripping the worn leather reins though she could not steer them. Jace kept his broad shoulders squared, his arms tight, his jaw clenched against the fear that stirred each time the woman's shallow breath faltered. By the time they reached his cabin, the moon was sinking lower, painting the roofline in silver. The structure stood weather-beaten at the edge of the grove, logs darkened by years of sun and rain. Its windows shuddered against the wind. Jace swung down from the saddle, boots crunching over frost-tipped grass. He lifted the woman first, cradling her body as though she were fragile porcelain, then helped the girl dismount. She landed unsteadily, eyes wide in the dim light, her face smeared with dust and dried tears. Her hand clutched the hem of his vest instinctively, even as suspicion lingered in her storm-gray gaze. Inside, the air smelled of old pine smoke and dust. The hearth lay cold, the ashes gray as bone, and shadows stretched long against the log walls. Jace laid the woman carefully on his narrow bed, tugging a woolen blanket over her broken frame. The girl, Mara, she had whispered her name earlier, stood close, her stick still clutched in one hand, her small shoulders drawn tight as though she expected at any moment to be cast out. Jace crouched, his massive frame shrinking to her height, and set his hat aside. "She'll rest here tonight," he said, his voice rough but calm. Mara's eyes flicked to her mother, then back to him. She said nothing, only hugged her doll tighter against her chest. Jace moved to the corner where kindling lay piled, struck flint against steel, and coaxed flame from spark. Soon the fire grew, its orange glow spilling warmth across the cabin, shadows leaping on the walls. He filled a battered tin cup from the barrel and dampened a cloth, then knelt once more at the woman's side. Patiently, he wiped the dust and blood from her face, slow strokes that revealed more of her bruises, and with each mark, his jaw hardened. She stirred faintly, but did not wake. Mara edged closer, still wary, eyes narrowed as though testing every motion of his hand. At last she spoke, her voice trembling but proud. "Her name is Isolde." Jace nodded, repeating the name with reverence. Isolde. He let the syllables linger, feeling the weight of them, and for the first time, Mara's expression softened. She loosened her grip on the stick and lowered it to the floor, though she remained standing guard beside her mother. The fire grew stronger, chasing back the chill that seeped from the earth. Jace cut a strip from an old shirt and tied it around Isolde's wrist to keep it straight, then laid the damp cloth across her brow. Mara leaned in close, watching his every move, her suspicion beginning to fray into fragile trust. When she saw him tuck the blanket carefully around her mother's shoulders, her small hand fell away from the stick altogether. She sat down on a chair near the hearth, her legs dangling above the floor, doll pressed tightly against her chest. Onyx snorted outside, the sound muffled through the wooden walls. Jace stepped out briefly, the cold air sharp against his lungs. The stallion tossed his head, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling as though catching every sound in the night. Jace rubbed his neck, murmuring low, "Easy, boy. They're safe in there." Onyx stilled under his hand, though his great body remained tense, a silent sentinel beneath the stars. When Jace turned back, he saw Mara had edged to the doorway, peeking out. Her small hand brushed the horse's reins shyly, whispering something too soft to hear. Onyx lowered his head, blowing a warm breath over her hair, and the girl smiled faintly before retreating inside. The firelight cast Isolde in hues of amber and shadow, her face pale beneath the bruises. Jace sat by the bed, shoulders heavy, and for a moment the crackle of wood blurred into another sound, one buried deep but sharp as glass. Laughter. Not the laughter of children or joy, but the sharp, jeering laughter of men in a saloon long ago. He saw again his brother Ethan, tall and hot-blooded, surrounded by men who mocked until fists and boots left him broken. Jace remembered running toward him, too late, the laughter still echoing even as the life drained from Ethan's eyes. The sound had carved itself into him, and tonight, as the wind carried faint echoes from Ironwood town, he could almost hear it again. His fist tightened around the knife in his lap, the fire's glow glinting on the steel. Mara's whisper pulled him back. "She'll get better, won't she?" He turned his head. The girl's eyes, lit in amber firelight, were hollow with hunger, but bright with desperate hope. He thought of lying, of offering comfort easy and false, but instead he answered with quiet certainty. "She will. Not quickly, not without pain, but she will." Mara hugged her doll closer. Her shoulders relaxed by a fraction, and for the first time since he had found her, her gaze lingered on him without flinching. She slid down from the chair, crept nearer, and placed the ragged doll on her mother's chest before retreating again. Jace understood. It was not full trust, but the first fragile step toward it. As the night deepened, exhaustion finally claimed her. She fought against it at first, chin bobbing as she tried to stay awake, eyes darting to her mother's still form. But hunger and fatigue were stronger, and at last her head drooped, her small body curling into the chair. The doll slipped from her grasp, landing softly on the rug. Jace rose, tucked a blanket around her shoulders, then sat again by the fire. He tended the flames through the night, feeding them sparingly, wiping Isolde's brow whenever she stirred. Each time he looked at her, bruised and battered but still breathing, he felt the echo of his brother's death and the bitter laughter that had haunted him. He swore silently that no hand would strike her again, not while he lived. Dawn came pale and cold, creeping through the cracks in the walls. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine resin, the air warmer than the night before. Isolde's color remained pale, yet her breathing was steadier, her lips less cracked, the faint warmth of survival returning. Mara stirred in the chair, rubbing her eyes. Jace set a plate before her, bread torn into pieces, and dried apples softened in water. He handed her the cup first, warning softly, "Drink slow." She obeyed, her gaze fixed on her mother, then ate in silence, whispering a small thank you when she finished. Jace leaned back, weariness heavy in his bones, but beneath it burned something steadier, a purpose he had not felt in years. The cabin no longer belonged to solitude alone. It had become a shelter of firelight, holding within it the breath of survival, the tentative spark of trust, and a vow that had already bound his life to theirs. The prairie dawn broke cold and wide, spilling pale light across Ironwood Mesa as Jace Callahan tightened the cinch on Onyx's saddle. The black stallion stood restless, ears twitching, nostrils flaring against the crisp air. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Mara shuffled out first, her small hands rubbing sleep from her storm-colored eyes, her patched dress brushing her thin legs. Isolde followed slowly, still weak, wrapped in Jace's old wool shawl, the bruises along her face livid against her pale skin. She leaned against the doorframe for balance, her breath uneven but steadier than the night before. Jace's voice was low, rough from a night without sleep. "We'll need flour, salt, more bandages. Best fetch them now before the sun climbs." He didn't explain further. Town would stare, whisper, judge. He knew it. But supplies had to be bought, and hiding from whispers had never saved anyone. He mounted first, broad shoulders casting a shadow across the yard. He lifted Mara into the saddle before him, settling her against his chest so she would not slip. Then, with a gentleness at odds with his muscled frame, he helped Isolde climb up behind him. She hesitated, shame flickering across her battered face, but he steadied her with one arm. "Hold fast," he murmured, and when she clutched the shawl tighter, he gave Onyx the signal to move. The ride into Ironwood was silent but heavy. The town came into view, roofs and storefronts catching early sunlight, dust rising as wagons rattled down the street. Already eyes turned, conversations faltered, men straightened from leaning posts, women paused with baskets in their arms, and even children slowed their play. It did not take words to know that rumors had reached every corner. Callahan had taken in the widow, the one marked by debts, the one left beaten in the dust. Onyx's hooves struck the ground with measured rhythm as they entered Main Street. The stallion's coal-black coat gleamed like oil in the sun, his muscled haunches rolling with every step, his height towering above most mounts tethered outside the saloon. Whispers ran like dry grass fire. "That's her. He's lost his senses. A debt don't wash clean." Mara felt the weight of those stares pressing down. She buried her face briefly against Jace's chest before straightening, small chin lifting in defiance she borrowed from him. Isolde's eyes stayed on the ground, her body swaying faintly with the horse's movement, but she heard the hiss of words trailing after them like barbed wire. They stopped at the mercantile. Jace swung down first, his boots hitting the boards with a solid thud. He reached up, lifting Mara into his arms before setting her gently on the porch. Then he turned, bracing Isolde as she slid from the saddle, her legs trembling but holding. For a heartbeat she clung to his arm, then forced herself to stand straight, the shawl pulled close around her shoulders. The murmurs around them, sharpened, cruel edges cutting deeper than any fist. Inside, the mercantile smelled of flour, leather, and kerosene. Behind the counter stood Mr. Weller, narrow-bodied, his apron spotless, his thin smile sharpened like a blade. He looked past Jace, straight to Isolde, and his tone oozed mockery. "Well, if it isn't Callahan, heard tell you've taken in strays." Isolde's face flushed, shame and desperation colliding. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I can work, scrub floors, mend clothes, anything to repay." Jace's voice cut through, low and iron steady. "She won't work for you, and she won't pay for what isn't hers." The room stilled. A ranch hand near the barrel shifted awkwardly. Two women froze mid-whisper, eyes darting from Jace's broad frame to the fragile figure at his side. Weller's smile did not falter, but his eyes narrowed. "Now, Callahan, you know how this town runs. A man leaves debts, they fall to his kin. That's the way it's always been." Jace stepped closer, his blue-gray eyes cold as steel. Mara, standing near his leg, gripped his hand tight. "Then it's time something changed. A mark against a man is his alone. It dies with him. It doesn't chain his wife, and it sure as hell doesn't chain his child." His words fell heavy in the hushed air. For a moment, even the scrape of boots outside seemed to pause. Then Onyx, tethered at the porch rail, tossed his head with a sharp snort. His hoof struck the packed earth, the crack ringing out like a pistol shot. Dust rose in a cloud, rattling the boards of the porch, and the window panes shivered faintly in their frames. The stallion's black eyes burned, ears pinned flat, muscles coiled with raw power. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. One boy stumbled back from the window, muttering, "Devil horse!" Even the women who had whispered fell silent, their hands tightening around their baskets. Weller's smile flickered. For the first time, his pen stilled over the ledger. Isolde lifted her gaze then, drawn to the sight of the horse outside. Onyx stood like a sentinel, dark and unyielding, as though his strength had been placed between her and the town itself. Something stirred in her chest, a flicker of safety, unfamiliar yet undeniable. She looked at Jace, and for a moment, the weight of her shame loosened. Jace dropped coins on the counter, his voice still calm, but edged with finality. "Flour, coffee, salt, bandages." Weller moved stiffly, gathering the goods without another word. Jace collected the sack, shifted it easily onto one broad shoulder, and placed his other hand firm against Mara's back as he guided her toward the door. Isolde followed, chin slightly higher than when she had entered. Back on Main Street, the crowd parted as Onyx stamped again, the glint of his black coat dazzling in the morning sun. Mara climbed into the saddle before Jace lifted Isolde behind him, his arm anchoring them both as though daring anyone to reach. The murmurs continued, but they were softer now, cautious rather than mocking. At the far end of the street, outside the saloon, Sheriff Walt Danner stepped into the light. 60 years old, heavy in the middle, but broad across the shoulders, his dark eyes carried the weight of decades. He watched silently, his mustache twitching, then tipped his hat toward Jace. It was not approval, nor was it warning. It was recognition, a wordless admission that a line had been drawn. Jace returned the gesture with a single nod. Then he urged Onyx forward, the stallion moving with measured power, hooves striking rhythm into the dust. Mara leaned against him, her hand clutching his coat, and Isolde steadied herself with both arms wrapped lightly around his waist. Together they rode out of town, leaving behind the whispers that had grown softer, though far from gone. For Jace, it did not matter. He had spoken his vow aloud, for all to hear, and even the fiercest stares could not take it back. For Isolde, it was the first time in years someone had stood between her and scorn. And for Mara, sitting secure in the saddle, the world suddenly felt less cruel, as though the strength of a cowboy and a black stallion could hold back the tide of judgment. Evening had settled over the mesa, with a red sky bleeding slowly into gray, the kind of twilight that swallowed sound and left the air heavy. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its warmth brushing against the battered walls. Isolde lay resting on the bed, her breathing shallow but steadier than days before, while Mara sat curled on a chair near the hearth, her small hands clutching her doll as though it might keep the world at bay. For a brief time, there had been peace, the kind of fragile silence that Jace Callahan had come to cherish, but even he knew it could not last. The first warning came with Onyx. The black stallion lifted his head from the trough outside, ears pricked and body stiff. A sharp snort burst from his nostrils, and Jace, seated by the fire, felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. Then the sound reached him, hooves pounding hard and fast across dry earth. 3 riders by the rhythm of it, moving with purpose rather than chance. Jace rose slowly, tall frame filling the dim light, his jaw set as he reached for his hat. Mara turned, her storm-colored eyes wide. "They're coming," she whispered. The doll slipped from her hands, landing soundlessly on the rug. Jace gave a small nod, steady but grim, and pushed open the cabin door. The riders arrived in a haze of dust, their horses lathered, their figures dark against the fading sun. At their head was Caleb Rourke, a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest. A beard streaked gray across his jaw. His eyes were dull iron, hardened by years of enforcing debts and bruising lives. 2 younger men flanked him, one chewing straw, the other with a sneer etched across his face, both with pistols swinging at their sides. Caleb swung down from his saddle with the ease of habit, spitting into the dirt as he squared his stance. "Callahan," he drawled, his voice rough. "You've taken in what ain't yours. That woman owes. A debt unpaid is a chain unbroken, and we're here to collect." Behind him, the younger men dismounted, boots crunching as they fanned slightly apart, eyes sharp on the cabin door. Mara stood there, half hidden, her hand clutching the frame. Her small chin lifted though her knees shook. Jace stepped onto the porch, shoulders squared, his presence filling the space even before he spoke. His voice was calm, but edged with steel. "Her debts died with her husband. She carries nothing but scars you bastards left on her skin. If there's shame to be named, it's not hers. It belongs to the men who raised their fists." Caleb's mouth twisted into a grin, teeth yellow in the fading light. "The world don't see it that way. Weakness carries. Shame carries. You should know, Callahan. Ain't you the one who let his own brother die under laughter?" The words struck like a blow, but Jace did not flinch. His jaw tightened, the memory of Ethan's broken body flashing in his mind. But he stood steady. His hand rested, lightly on the porch railing, his gaze fixed on Caleb. "I learned that night what silence costs. I won't pay it again." From inside, the cabin door creaked and Isolde appeared. She leaned heavily against the frame, one hand braced against the wood, Mara darting to her side to hold her steady. Her face was pale, bruises vivid under the shawl she clutched close, but her eyes burned with fragile courage. Her lips parted, her voice low. "If it's me you want, then take—" "No," Jace cut her off, his voice sharp, resonant. "It is not you. It never was you. You don't bear his mistakes, and you don't carry their cruelty. That weight is theirs, not yours." For a moment, Isolde's body shook, tears welling at the corners of her eyes. The words pierced deeper than any wound, a truth she had longed to hear, yet never believed she would. Mara pressed her face against her mother's side, her small hand clutching tight. And for the first time in years, Isolde felt the stone of shame shift from her chest. Caleb stepped forward, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. "Fine words, cowboy, but you're one man standing against the tide. What happens when the tide comes in?" Onyx answered before Jace did. The stallion surged forward from his tether, muscles rippling beneath his obsidian coat. He struck the earth with his hooves, each blow echoing like thunder. Dust exploded upward, and the other horses shrieked, jerking hard against their reins. Caleb's mount reared violently, nearly unseating him. The 2 younger men cursed, struggling to control their skittish animals, their bravado faltering as the black Mustang's power shook the air. Jace moved down the steps, his boots crunching in rhythm with Onyx's fury, man and beast standing side by side as though cut from the same stone. His voice carried low but unyielding. "Let the town remember what it likes, but it'll remember this too. Shame belongs to the ones who strike, not to the ones who survive. If you want to take her, you'll have to come through me, and through him." Onyx threw back his head, mane wild, eyes burning. He pawed the ground again, the force of it rattling the porch boards, sending another cloud of dust into the fading light. Caleb froze, his fingers hovering above his holster. For a moment, the world hung in silence. Then his horse jerked again, wild-eyed, and Caleb stumbled back, barely keeping his footing. His jaw tightened as he spat into the dirt. "This ain't over," he snarled, signaling to his men. They mounted hastily, their bravado stripped bare, and turned their horses toward the horizon. The thunder of their retreat faded across the mesa, leaving behind only the rasp of wind through dry grass and the steady, heavy breath of the black stallion. Jace stepped forward and laid his hand against Onyx's neck, his palm steady, grounding the raw power that still surged through the animal. Man and horse stood as one, a wall between the cabin and the darkness beyond. Isolde sank slowly onto the porch step, tears streaking her bruised face. Mara pressed close beside her, clutching her mother's shawl, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with awe. When she looked at Jace, her gaze held something new, as if she had seen him transform the world around them with nothing but his strength and his refusal to bend. Jace looked back at them, the fire of resolve steady in his chest. He had not only spoken to Caleb and his men, but to the woman and child behind him, and to the ghosts that haunted him still. The shame no longer belonged to them. Whatever battles remained, they would not face them alone. The evening after the confrontation at the cabin settled heavy on Ironwood. Word of the standoff had rippled through town faster than prairie wind, reshaped by every mouth until Jace Callahan became the talk of every table. Some whispered he was a fool for standing against Caleb Rourke. Others said the widow and her child had bewitched him. A few, fewer than he could count on one hand, spoke quietly of admiration. By nightfall, Jace knew he could not let the weight of rumor do all the talking. The saloon at the center of town glowed with lantern light, laughter spilling into the dust-choked street. The music of a half-broken piano clattered faintly inside, but it could not drown the sharper sound of men laughing at another's shame. When Jace pushed through the swinging doors, every head turned. The smoke parted around his frame, as if making space for the broad-shouldered cowboy, whose name had been carried in every whisper since yesterday. Caleb Rourke leaned against a table near the back, boots propped carelessly on a chair. His beard was streaked with gray, his hands thick with scars, his eyes narrowed with the smug certainty of a man who had ruled by intimidation too long. Around him lounged two younger riders, one wiry with a crooked nose, and the other heavier, face pinched by a perpetual sneer. They laughed loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Callahan's lost his edge," the wiry one jeered. "Trading iron for pity, a horse for a widow's tears." The words drew more laughter, though not all of it was full-hearted. Some men kept their eyes low, unsure, and the barkeep, a stooped man with thinning hair, polished glasses with tense hands, as if bracing for blood. Sheriff Walt Danner stood near the bar, his mustache twitching, his gaze following Jace. He said nothing, but his presence was steady, a reminder that law still breathed in Ironwood, even if it rarely roared. Jace walked forward, each step measured, the sound of his boots echoing like a slow drum. His hat brim shadowed his gray-blue eyes, but nothing could hide the iron set of his jaw. He stopped in the center of the room, his voice carrying without need of force. "I hear you've all been busy speaking on debts, on shame, on what belongs to who. So hear me now. The widow and her child are not yours to mark again. They carry no chain, no burden. That shame belongs to the men who struck her, not the woman who endured." The room fell silent, but for the creak of wood. Caleb smirked, straightening, his voice sharpened. "World don't bend to speeches, Callahan. A woman beaten in the street stays marked. You can preach all you want, but when the tide comes, even you'll drown." He reached for his glass, then slammed it hard against the table so whiskey sloshed across the boards. His men shifted, one hand twitching near a revolver. For a moment it seemed steel might speak louder than words. But Jace did not flinch. His hand stayed at his side, his voice low, yet cutting sharper than any blade. "You think me one man standing alone, but I've got more at my back than you'll ever know. A black stallion who'd trample your lies into dust. A child who already stands taller than men twice her age. A woman who survived more than your fists could break. You call that weakness, I call it strength." The barkeep froze mid-motion. A murmur rippled at the edges of the room. Even Caleb's sneer faltered as his own riders hesitated, their bravado cracking under the weight of Jace's certainty. Sheriff Danner lifted his glass, set it down with finality, and his silence seemed a quiet endorsement. Caleb's lips curled, but his voice dropped, no longer carrying the same strength. "This isn't over," he muttered. His men lowered their hands, and the moment passed like a thunderhead drifting, heavy but broken. Jace tipped his hat once, turned, and strode back into the night. Behind him, the saloon remained hushed, the echo of his vow lingering longer than any laughter could. When he returned to the cabin, the fire still glowed faintly in the hearth. Mara lay curled near it, her doll at her side, though her eyes fluttered open when the door creaked. Isolde sat awake on the bed, the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her voice thin. "You can't keep them away forever," she whispered. "Every time I think I can breathe again, the weight comes back heavier. You'll spend yourself fighting shadows, and in the end, they'll take everything." Jace set his hat on the table, sat down heavily in the chair across from her. The firelight carved deep lines across his face, but his eyes were steady. "You think you brought me nothing but trouble, but listen close. Before you and that girl, my days were empty. I rode trails that ended in silence, came home to four walls filled with ghosts. Now, when I rise, I hear her laughter. When I work, I know there are two souls who need me to come back. That isn't trouble, Isolde. That's purpose." Her lips trembled, eyes filling though she tried to look away. For years she had heard only jeers, only voices calling her burden, trouble, debt. To hear the opposite spoken with such certainty cracked something inside her. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears slipping free. But they were not born of shame. They were lighter, carrying something closer to release. Mara stirred, rising to her knees, her small face bright with the glow of the fire. She clutched her doll for a heartbeat, then set it aside, standing taller as if she no longer needed it. "Mama," she said softly, "he won't let us fall." Her little hands curled into fists, mimicking the way she had seen Jace's do when he faced the men at the saloon. Her chin lifted, pride flickering where fear once lived. Isolde reached for her daughter, pulling her close, her tears falling into the girl's hair. Jace watched, his chest heavy but steady, knowing that strength had already begun to grow in them, not borrowed but becoming their own. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but inside the fire burned strong, binding them together in its glow. For Jace, the fight was no longer about debts or shame. It was about the meaning that had returned to his life, carried on the fragile shoulders of a widow and her child. And as Mara stood straighter by the hearth, her eyes gleaming with new resolve, he understood that they were no longer simply surviving. They were becoming something stronger. The night after Caleb Rourke and his men had thundered away from the cabin was unnaturally still. The mesa spread wide beneath a sky thick with stars that pulsed like distant fires. The dust of hooves had settled, but the tension clung to the air, as if the land itself remembered the clash. Jace Callahan lingered outside in the cool dark, his broad frame silhouetted against the firelight, spilling faintly from the cabin window. Beside him stood Onyx, the black stallion calm now, his breath misting in steady clouds, his eyes reflecting starlight like embers. Jace laid a hand against the horse's neck, feeling the warmth and power beneath the coat, and for a long moment he let himself breathe. It was not victory he felt, but a strange, steadying peace. He thought of how empty the cabin had been before, nights filled with silence, days marked only by labor and the trail. He had carried the memory of his brother's death like a stone in his chest, convinced he was meant to ride alone until the dust swallowed him whole. Yet now, inside that same cabin, there was laughter waiting to be born, a woman whose courage outshone her wounds, and a child who had already begun to find her strength. He closed his eyes, whispered a wordless vow to the stars, then turned and stepped back inside. The fire in the hearth cast amber light across the room, shadows flickering against the walls. Isolde sat propped up against a stack of folded blankets, the shawl wrapped close around her thin shoulders. Her face still bore the marks of cruelty, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in weeks. Mara sat at her mother's side, the doll abandoned at her feet, watching the flames with a serious expression too old for her years. When the door opened and Jace entered, both looked up, and for a moment he felt the weight of their trust like something tangible in the air. He crossed the room without a word, went to a shelf where a small tin box lay hidden among odds and ends. Opening it, he drew out a silver band, simple and smooth, polished by time. It had belonged to his mother, the last piece of her he carried. He held it in his calloused palm, staring at it as though weighing not just the ring, but the life it symbolized. Then he turned, sinking slowly to one knee before Isolde. Her breath caught, her hand clutching the shawl tighter. "You don't have to do more," she whispered, her voice quiet but trembling. "You've given us food, shelter, your strength. You've stood where no one else ever stood. That's more than I ever thought I'd have again." Jace shook his head gently, his voice low but steady, every word carrying the weight of his years. "All my life, I've ridden through silence, with nothing waiting at the end of the trail but ghosts. Then I found you in the dust, and the world shifted. You and Mara gave me back something I thought long gone. If you'll let me, I'll be gentle every step, not for a night, not for a season, but for as long." As I draw breath, Isolde pressed her lips together, eyes brimming, her body trembling not from weakness, but from the breaking of chains she had carried too long. She looked down at Mara, who stared back at her with wide, storm-colored eyes, searching her mother's face for permission to hope. Isolde's tears spilled freely, and she whispered, almost to herself, "Yes." Then louder, her voice cracking but true, "Yes, I will walk with you." Jace's hand, scarred and steady, slid the ring onto her finger. The silver gleamed in the firelight, a promise sealed not with grandeur, but with quiet resolve. Isolde lifted her hand to her lips, as though afraid the ring might vanish if she let it go unseen. Her tears fell, but they were no longer heavy with shame. They carried relief, release, the fragile joy of someone finally seen as whole. It was then Mara made a sound neither of them had heard from her since that terrible day in the dust. Laughter, soft at first, then rising, high and bright. A laugh that burst like a bird breaking free of a cage. She clapped her hands, her small body trembling with the unfamiliar joy, then scrambled up onto the bed. Throwing her arms around her mother, she pressed her face into Isolde's neck, still giggling through her tears. "Mama," she whispered breathlessly, "we're safe now." Isolde wrapped both arms around her daughter, holding her close, and for the first time in years, she did not feel like she was clinging to something fragile. Instead, she felt grounded, anchored by love and by the man who stood beside them. Mara then reached one small hand toward Jace, tugging at his sleeve with shy boldness. He leaned closer, and she whispered fiercely, "You won't let us fall." Jace's throat tightened, but he nodded once, resting a broad hand gently against her back. Outside, Onyx shifted, stamping his hoof against the ground, a deep snort breaking the night's stillness. Jace looked toward the window, catching sight of the stallion's silhouette, proud and unwavering in the starlight. It struck him then how Onyx had carried him through years of solitude, never faltering, always steady, and how fitting it was that the horse should bear witness now to the vow that bound not just man and woman, but a family newly formed. The cabin grew quiet again, save for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind beyond the shutters. Isolde rested her head against Jace's chest, Mara tucked safely between them, and for the first time, the silence was not hollow, but whole. The shadows no longer pressed heavy against the walls, but danced softly, bearing witness to a promise spoken in silver and sealed in laughter. Jace lifted his gaze once more to the window, to the black stallion who stood watch beneath the stars, and felt certainty settle into him like bedrock. His trail had ended here, not in loneliness, but in the firelit glow of a family found. Sometimes the greatest miracles of the Lord do not come with thunder or lightning, but in the quiet vows spoken by people who have been broken and healed through love. Jace, Isolde, Mara, and even the faithful horse Onyx remind us that God's grace can take an empty life and fill it with purpose, that He can turn shame into strength, and that no one is too lost to be found again. In our daily lives, we too face struggles, loneliness, or burdens that feel too heavy. Yet God is gentle every step, just as Jace promised to be, guiding us with patience and love when we least expect it. If this story touched your heart, remember that His hand is never far from yours. And I invite you to share this story with others who might need encouragement today. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and if you believe in the miracle of God's gentle love, write Amen in the comments as a prayer together. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that carry light and hope, and may the Lord bless and keep you always.